So, having said that, it's welcome, and I'll start off just by calling out the provocation and just put a couple of things out there for us to just look at. And from there, I think it's time for us to, I'll hand over to Marian and Chris to get, to keep the discussions moving. But why won't that move? There we go. The provocation is to do with inclusivity and what are the design implications? What issues do teachers face in terms of inclusivity in the classroom? And there's a little bit to sort of build the provocation a bit further. I pulled this little section from a chapter that Chris and myself and Ben Cleveland wrote for a book on inclusivity or participation in the workplace, in the school place. And it really struck me when Chris pulled this data together that this is fairly loose. It's not like you can say, here are all the statistics on it, but it is a fairly accurate, I suppose, summary that actually, it's about 1 in every 5 children in classrooms has some sort of issue to do with that might hinder their full participation in the activities of that classroom. And that is actually the reality of what teachers have to face in their day-to-day teaching. And I suppose the issue to do with this is how can we design spaces, design furniture, and obviously curriculum and processes and policies to somehow or other have a situation where all kids have equal chance of participating fully in the space. Look, some of this stuff is fairly frightening, that 1 in up to 20% of students need some sort of specific support, and that is across the neurological and physical disabilities sector. But also all of those complex things that are realities in today's classrooms to do with attention deficit, autism, etc., that list of things, speech, vision, and audio processing disorders. We know that a really large number of students, for instance, suffer some sort of audio processing issue. And that the design of spaces with poor acoustics can really hinder their full participation in this classroom. And the other part that Chris's section of that chapter pulled out was the fact that actually teachers have to deal with this, that it's not just the fact that this exists and we need to try to help children to participate more fully and sort of deal with all of these issues that might exist in a classroom. The reality is teachers have to live with it every day, and sometimes that's a school-based strategy to deal with it. Sometimes like a classroom-based teaching type strategy. Sometimes it's a school-based issue that they have to deal with. And sometimes it's actually bringing external bodies back into the classroom to help to build the sorts of things that need to help those students' participation. And I hope when Mark gets back on board and gets well, he'll continue this conversation into more depth, but also, we'll keep that conversation going around the whole notion of the design of spaces. How do ILESE help this happen? Because the reality is a lot of students are actually in need of extra support to be able to participate properly in day-to-day life in the classroom, participate equitably. And our job as designers, as teachers, etc., is to simply to make that happen. So I'll hand over to Mark and Marian and Chris or anyone else to jump in and just start talking about, well, what are some of the practical issues that we're dealing with here? I don't know. Chris, I've cited you a couple of times here. You're a principal in the school. Do you want to just say anything? I think we lost Chris. No?
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah. Thanks, Wes. Yeah, look, associate principal, I don't want to get above my station. I'll give myself anything more to do tomorrow. Look, I mean, when we sort of wrote that, we were looking really at learners with specific challenges in terms of accessing the curriculum and also accessing the environment as well. And 20% for that might sound a bit conservative. I think we've got some parts of school where 30-35% may be more realistic, but that certainly brings up a lot of implications for not only the design of learning but also how we accommodate all of those specific needs in the soft infrastructure, if you like, of the school system and the people part of the system, and how we deploy professionals into to support those learners, but also actually specifically about the design itself, and what is it that we're doing specifically for those learners, especially when we have the opportunity to reinvigorate an environment, to transform, or to rebuild, or to start from scratch. So look, I'm really interested in the experiences people have had, and some of those specific things that they've found are working really well. And I know we've got some people here who are in the special education field as well. So yeah, I think opening up really to find out what are people finding.
I'm just because I'm conscious I'm going to shoot off shortly there, Chris and Wesley. I know within certainly Parramatta Diocese anyway, it's a growing need, and it's a recognising also that we're pushing back on traditional building formulas and whatnot to ensure that we've got staffing and also funding and also other resources to actually cater for people with additional needs, whether it's cognitive, whether it's physical. I know just recently in the primary schools, I'm now making sure we have counsellor rooms built into the school structure, whereas traditionally you'd have that in secondary schools. In our sector anyway, you wouldn't really have them in primary schools. So we're putting them in there now because there's a growing need, wellbeing need is becoming really evident, and also it's about providing additional services within that community. So it's easier for parents as well, having those multiple services. Certainly at St. Luke's, it's got 5 services there. It's got a high support needs whole unit for 30 odd students plus counsellors, etc. So yeah, it's certainly we're only at the cottage stage, I would say. There's a long way to go.
Can I just pull it back a little bit, Paul, and ask you, how does the Catholic at Parramatta define inclusion?
Look, that's a good point too, because we provide inclusion up to moderately intellectually disabilities. In terms of intellectual disability, we don't do further than that. And then with physical, we said no real definition. I'll have to find out, but I'm conscious that I don't believe we do as well as public education there in that regards. It just hasn't been there, but it's certainly, we've got resources just like everybody else. So we should be doing better.
Thanks, Paul. I might actually ask Kathleen then, because she is in the public school sector. How do you define inclusive education
I'm going to hand over. So we actually, we forward this invitation to a lot of people, as you can see here, and I'm just looking for the person that's here.
Karen. Karen?
Hang on.
I was thinking
Karen. There you go. Thank you. Yeah, there was a couple of people, I think, but yes. Thank you, Rebecca.
So there's about 8,000 pieces of literature in the world about what is inclusive education. And as my university lecturer said to me last week, we are never going to reach consensus. At the Department of Education, we say that we're committed to improving practice across all settings, and that you can be an inclusive school no matter what type of setting. So it's really just about supporting all students to learn to their greatest potential using evidence-based practices, no matter what setting. So I know that this contravenes some advocacy groups, but that's not a conversation that we need to go into, but that is it. All settings inclusive.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Oh, I knew that.
Sure,
we're so like together, mate.
Yeah, and I noticed Chloe too as well. Yeah. She just shared something. Thanks, Karen. I knew there was no way I was going to answer that question.
I actually looked into, my first PhD, when I started my first PhD, I actually was doing research in inclusive education. And you're right, Karen, there are about 800 pieces of literature that defines inclusive education in different ways. But the one thing that I do, a lot of the discussion in literature is about how we include students in the normal curriculum, right? There's nothing to say about the social environment. There's nothing to talk about within the physical environment as well. So I'm just wondering whether do you know, Karen, of anything that has talked specifically around that intersection between social, physical, and curriculum?
If you look down in the chat, my colleague Chloe has put in our inclusive education statement for students with disabilities, and that's based on 6 principles. And I'm not going to take over this meeting. And you are super duper happy to contact me and we can have all the chats because clearly we have a shared passion. But really it is about parent care inclusion, student agency, self-determination, curriculum, but also, as you're right, social and cultural inclusion, building workforce capability. That's where we stand, and we've just launched our policy, and we're not going to make this meeting about inclusivity. I'm so conscious that I'll take over, so I'll just be quiet.
We do have a comment from Steve, though.
Sorry, just finding the mute button. It seemed to be quite a long way away, as it does, doesn't it, at times. My name's Steve Edwards, speaking from Christchurch, and in particular, the project for Grow Waitaha, which was based around the rebuild of Christchurch City after it was destroyed by earthquakes 10 years ago. So in the event of rebuilding a city, there's an enormous number of schools that were destroyed and or partially destroyed and required rebuilds, and are still in fact being rebuilt. There's 135 of them to be precise. The city is about 500,000 people in population. One of the significant components in the build of a school to perhaps consider in regard to meeting the needs of all groups, but in particular the groups that we've been speaking about, the inclusive nature, is when getting towards the build project itself, are the right voices, are all the voices in the room and being heard and influencing the design of the said school. And in the way that ILEs tend to be today, the construction of these buildings means that they're also incredibly fixable, or flexible, I should say. That is to say, they don't ever need to be finished. The hammer is down, the build is finished, and that's how it remains. So this means that the adaptability to adjust and change depending on things such as the digitalization of resourcing, the physicality, the coloration of the provisions, the visual stimulus, the increasing knowledge around how to help and work with people with various impairments and things. They're individualized, but a classroom isn't individualized. It's generic for a group of people. So there's a tension between the two in order to do the best we can for each and every student. So in the design process, when people are coming together to decide what are we going to build here, we have enjoyed in the Greater Christchurch area the opportunity for key players from each school, not across the city, but from each school, to come together and develop the education brief. And the very topic that we're covering today is absolutely on the must discuss and must have answers to component. And the architects associated with the builds wait for that information to know how to go about putting the lines on the page, how to go about making the best effect. And the inclusion in some ways goes beyond those which are perhaps discussed today, even into the cultural components and so on and so forth. But particularly, and I'm just closing in on that, reasserting my point, is through the design of a school, are the right voices involved at the right time so that the optimum build outcome can be achieved, and that optimum build is not done and dusted when the builder leaves the site, that it's ongoing into the future potential so that things can change with time. So I'll just leave it there. I hope that sort of captured a few points there. But we've been very lucky to be able to have the opportunity to activate that type of process in our schools.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Steve.
Sorry.
Thanks. I have so many questions, but I just wanted to say that from our research, I think New Zealand is at a system level is leading the way when it comes to inclusive learning environments and inclusive education. You have a whole wealth of resources on your websites and things like that. But yeah, I'm open to have these conversations, continue to have these conversations. We have Rebecca.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that point of the idea of the hammer sort of doesn't go down, if you like. But I work a lot with the teachers, and I think that idea is that it can be continued in the idea that even if the building itself doesn't necessarily change, that the environment, you're actually co-creating that environment, that, you know, as you work in there and the kids work in there, you're creating a different environment through the work that you're actually doing, or you're enhancing it, you're shifting it. It's constantly evolving. The environment is influencing the teachers and the kids, and the kids and the teachers are influencing the environment itself. So it's not, you know, it's not just sort of creating the walls and the spaces and then putting the hammer down, because, you know, you have to have all those other things that are actually creating the environment, not just the space itself, or thinking about the space and the environment as, I guess, two sides of one coin, and that they have to know that they can influence the environment and understand that the environment itself is influencing them too. Otherwise, they may not notice what they're doing, or where they're missing like a possible opportunity for further inclusion or shifting the practice, you know, of whatever they're doing. So something that we work a lot on is trying to support people to notice what they're doing, when they're doing it, how they're doing it, and what other things they might like to try to support increased inclusion over time.
Thanks, Rebecca. Sorry, I forgot, what's your background? Are you an educator or from?
Yeah, from SLEC, and my job is a PL advisor. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks. Anybody has a comment with regard to, we talked about the design a little bit, and I want to get a little bit more into that, but Rebecca also brought in what happens after the design is built. So that comes in, and acoustics comes into that picture then. Furniture, I'm looking at steel case, comes into the picture then. So how do we plan for all these things? Anybody?
Yeah, well, just jumping in on what both Steve and Rebecca has raised, I think that what that comes down to is that those aspects of the process, both pre-design and involving all the stakeholders, and post-occupancy, both need to be resourced by wherever the resourcing comes from in your area. So, for example, with what Steve was talking about with Waitaha, which obviously they did a fabulous job, but it doesn't necessarily roll out like that in the rest of the country. Like I've sort of seen education briefs put together by a wise consultant working alongside the principal on the board of trustees, and not necessarily involving all of the stakeholders. And that simply came down to resourcing. And the same for post-occupancy. I think that in terms of supporting the teachers in terms of what teaching and learning is going to look like in this space, and in terms of how they're going to collaborate, how they're going to co-teach, and what is going to have the best bang for buck for all of the learners. Once again, that needs resourcing. And it's pretty hit and miss from what my observations as to whether that is going to get resourced or not.
I might add to that.
To money. Yep, so, Kathleen.
I might add to that, Sandra, because when you've got it working well, people just think it's just working well. They don't actually realise there's a lot of work going on in the background to make it work well and to keep it working well. Because what I was going to add earlier, particularly on Rebecca's comments, there's so many places this can fall down. And if one of them's a weak point, the whole lot, people lose sight of why pieces of furniture are there, or why they're not there, or why a wall is a certain colour. And everything can kind of fall down based on one weak point. And it might be a teacher who's not skilled, either in support students or in innovative learning environments, or, you know, in collaborating with other teachers, whatever the list goes on, but also could be a weakness in, I mean, we've seen examples where there's hooks with a television hanging and you'll see kids hanging off it. And it's a great idea. So the TV could move up and down for different heights and requirements, but then it kicked off another issue. You know, without no one meant unwell by it, but it's just, you kind of got to identify those risks through evaluation before you know not to let them happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of other stuff that I can think of, like colors, for instance, that play a part in the learning environment as well. Owen, you have your hands up.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm Owen from Hong Kong. I'm part of Ambwise's team with Steelcase. A couple of things really kind of hit out to me. One of the things that we've been really exploring is how do we work longer term partnering with our clients? Because furniture investing in a space, it can be seen as quite fixed. You know, you make an investment. If you're doing it on a larger scale, you're putting furniture into a space and then you're kind of stuck with that. So one of the things we've been really working on is how do we use more piloting? How do we create a bit more of a flexible environment so that we can put something in, we can make sure it's working, we can gather feedback over time, and really have a bit of a more of an open and back and forth conversation with our clients, with the end users, with the students, with all the different stakeholders in a space, to hopefully kind of alleviate some of those issues that we've had. Of course, it's never going to be completely foolproof. You still always have a case where a teacher might leave and then someone else comes in and they say, why have you gone with this here? And exactly like you said, you lose track of the original purpose. But that's been something that we've been really putting a lot of thought into, especially with some of our larger clients here in Hong Kong. At how do we kind of have much more of a back and forward conversation rather than just here's your furniture, I'll see you in 10 years when it's up and you need more.
I'm sure if you ask the schools, Owen, everybody would be happy to trial your furniture and provide you feedback. I mean, I'll volunteer my classrooms if you want to try out your furniture.
You know, funnily enough, we've never had problems finding people that are keen to trial. But again, it's about the thing what we found is where we've had the most success has been mutual investment. So what we're investing in a school, we're investing in a project. We believe in what the school is trying to do, and the schools have been able to invest as well. So it's not just a case of we're throwing free stuff, which to be honest is what I think we used to do. You know, we used to just throw in a bunch of furniture into a classroom and say, this is what we do. This is why that has worked that way. But actually, again, what we found is when we're saying, okay, let's invest together. Let's create a space in a particular way. So that data collection starts before we even deliver. How are you using your space now? What do you want to be changing in that space? How can you make it more inclusive, as an example? And then making sure we're actually following up so that it's not just a case of, again, throwing the furniture in and saying, we'll see what it looks like in 6 months. It's a case of, okay, are we talking to as many stakeholders as we can? Is the school collecting data? Are we collecting actual usable data that can be, that can come back and say, okay, this worked, this didn't. So for the next iteration, how do we move forward and take that on?
Yeah, good point. And I like that you brought in the data thing as well. So how do we find evidence to see whether it works or not?
Well, again, I'm very conscious. I don't want to be taking all the conversation. Apologies.
So opening up to everybody. You know, how do we find data? How do we continue to get data and evidence to show that something's working in an inclusive learning environment? Okay, I think because that's one of the biggest issue that we have as well, right? We might have an inclusive learning environment, but how do we continuously make improvements to that learning environment? How do you collect data?
I'm going to jump in. I think it's ongoing. It can't be just a one-off, which we have a habit of doing, because the students that you have in the first year or the second year or third year might be very different to the students you have in the fifth year. You've also got wear and tear on furniture, or maybe the wheels fall off and you can't move it anymore, or it starts to lose some of its affordances. So it's got to be ongoing, and it's got to be across all stakeholders, including the people providing the furniture because they're paying for it. So it's got to be replaced every year. That's another element to be considered.
It's also trying to connect furniture design PL to student outcomes, because that's mediated by pedagogy and teachers. So to make the connection between design, teaching and learning, and student outcomes, what are we measuring? What do we actually want to know? How can you find the connection through that mediating factor of teaching or practice? I think is probably a little bit of the, I don't know what the word is, but like if we knew, we'd almost be able to get to world peace, right? Because that's so hard to connect, and that like we've been asking ourselves the same thing.
Yeah.
How do we know that what we do in SLEC with our professional learning resources and advice and so forth has impact on student outcomes? How do we actually know that we are improving, in this instance, the inclusivity and the, you know, the meaningful engagement with learning and all those things that you can pull in about, you know, inclusive education through the PL that we're doing? And that is really, really hard to tell. Like you can measure improvement in confidence in teachers, but does that lead into changed outcomes? Like, are students meeting their goals individually better, or whatever it is that you're looking for? So I think that's a very, very tricky question, and we're still grappling with it.
Yeah,
Sure.
and outcomes is also quite broad. I mean, we can talk about engagement, for instance. We can talk about communication, for instance. How do you measure all these things? Anybody? Yes, Hamish.
I could jump in here. I'm an architect, and one of the things that we get involved with is selection of furniture. And you know, we're not experts at that at all, really. But there's a group that are kind of quite expert at it, which is the kids. And we've done it on a few school sites now, where you don't fill up the classroom with furniture. You actually just get some key items and see what the kids gravitate towards. So if it's not really data, and it's not scientific, but it's organic, and the outcome can be quite powerful. So rather than, you know, as I say, rather than investing all the money on a bunch of furniture and have half it not being used or not preferred, get a range of it, see what happens in the classroom or the learning environment, and see what's being used more. And I think, and we've done that with prototyping stuff. We've done it with new schools. We've done it with kind of rebuilds, and I think it's a really quite a powerful technique, pretty basic and simple, but actually has a nice outcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamish. That's a good point. Diversity. Any other comments? Feedback, insights?
I think June's raised a point in the chat about this idea of what other needs are there.
Yep.
And you know, sometimes people don't know, well, we don't know what we don't know ever, really. So, you know, you might say, what do we need here? Or ask the kids to trial things, you know, particular items or particular pieces of furniture or particular designs. But also if they don't see what opportunities are being offered to them because they don't have the experience, whether that be children or adults, and they don't see where that action opportunity lies, then they won't take it, because they don't know it's there, or they're not reading the cues in the building, or they're not understanding what's expected of them in a particular context. So, you know, really working into teaching that or learning that, I think is key, because, you know, if I've never seen, you know, whatever it is, if I've never seen a window opened and I didn't know you could open a window, then I'm probably not going to open the window, right? So I might need to be told that you can open a window, or shown this is how you open a window. Otherwise you wouldn't do it.
Exactly. I've spoken to a teacher before where, you know, they didn't even know they could open, like you said, you know, they just needed to press a button. They didn't even know the button was there.
Yeah, I'd agree with Rebecca there. I mean, it's a combination of both experience and you know, practical experience, but also then input also from those people who are going to be using, or reflections on that, or feedback from that. In the end, there's a learning intent, and the learning intent is personalised for that learner, and that's what you're designing for. So it's critical that the educators actually really understand the learner, and they can translate that need to the architects. And that's usually where the gap gap is missed, is in that translation. And just hearing, I think, Hamish, you were just mentioning there that as an architect, you're often asked to supply furniture or something like that. Or architects are asked to design spaces. And I sit back and go, why would you ask an architect to design a surgery, a doctor's surgery? Well, no, you be very clear about your requirements, and then they do go away and design it. They don't provide, they don't specify the particular bits of furniture and whatnot, So there has to be greater input from the educators and the professionals to inform the architects and the designers to deliver, that really precise environments, and they are precise.
I think consideration as well about different types of students, and not just picking this is the table or chairs we're going to use, and selecting it in small, medium, large, and then putting it in different areas of a school. The schools that I've seen be really successful is where they've thought about different age groups and then matched the furniture to match the learning for those age groups, and haven't generically just gone, let's order these tables in small, medium and large and put them through their school. They've ordered some of the same equipment, but often they've thought about what they want to teach and how they want to teach, and then match their furniture to that. But it's not happening in all schools. They're not thinking about it that way. They're just going a chair, a desk, and let's order some, and order them in small, medium and large.
And that's where, Rebecca, education systems or the larger systems have the opportunity there. Because if you're just in a school and you're doing this once off, you don't get that opportunity. You don't have the experience. If you're an education system and you're working across a vast number of schools, you do have that opportunity to develop the experience, and then learn from that experience to apply to the next. And that's where it happens. I often feel that it's really hard for those individual schools who are then they get a one-off opportunity to do this major refurbishment or something like that and spend millions of dollars. And you often see the same mistakes being made, and you go, well, that's just wrong. It's a wasted resource. But we do know there's a lot of research out there, what works and what doesn't work, and there's a lot of experience too.
Thanks, Paul. I'm gonna go back to what Steve said in the beginning about getting different voices, and then take your point, Paul, about how we get those voices into the design of a space. So if in a school, regular school, we have a lot of teachers, educators, there might be one or two inclusive education specialists or special education specialists who might be potentially focused on particular learning areas, not all. How do we make sure we get enough voices to make sure that we are getting the right furniture, getting the right acoustics, getting the right color, getting the right, all these factors into the design of the learning environment? Who should we be asking?
I mean, again, just goes back to that strategic resourcing. If you're operating at a system level or across a number of schools, it's very hard for those individual schools. But I think Chris mentioned it earlier on. It's about connecting those people and bringing them together and building those networks. And if it could be the case, like forums like this, and certainly the University of Melbourne's their research, Learn Research becoming a particular repository of networking and knowledge and experience that feeds into those individual schools that individual schools can access. As you pointed out, the New Zealand resources are set out and laid out very well on inclusive education. Now, if we had that at a national level, rather than everybody creating their own, I think that would be something that would be very valuable.
I think it's interesting, Paul, and you saying about the idea of it being a one-off experience for schools, and often I think, going back to what Sandra was talking about, or Steve was talking about, the educational brief, for many principals, that's turning out to be a once in a career move, that they have to actually go through that process. And I know what you're saying there, Sandra, about wise consultants going and sitting alongside principals for a month. But I must admit, not claiming to be a wise consultant, but I did have an experience last month where a principal said, look, I've got to hand this in at the end of February. I've got 3.5 weeks. Now that raises all sorts of questions about, how on earth are you possibly going to, how on earth are you going to manage to do a decent job of that? And that sort of points more towards the sort of system and the urgency that suddenly drives, that urgency drives out the important stuff. And so to then actually be able to engage and consult with the right people and get the right people around the table when faced with such urgency is a real barrier. So how do you then, then at that stage, people like Hamish, who are actually at the chalk face of designing, actually offer a huge, a huge level of expertise because they're in it all the time, and actually engage with schools and know what, know many of those questions that they should be asking. Yeah.
I think you raised some very, very good points, and they are always points that we need to sort of almost have a list of reference list to, so that we don't fall into a safe zone and oversee things as developments occur when schools are being built. But just a couple of comments. Hamish's point around involving the students is huge. I just support that view entirely, because what the adult brain sees and thinks and what the students are able to bring to that together comes up in every case with surprises and a better outcome for sure. I just really underscore what was said earlier in regard to that. And Chris, not saying that, we've always got room to improve, by crikey we have, but within the Grow Waitaha framework, and indeed the Taraikura one, because I know Sandra, we've had a chat to one side, Taraikura is achieving this. The right to say no, we can't do it in 3.5 weeks. We haven't done the background, we haven't got the voices, but we will have it ready by this particular point. And so to be able to just push back in order to get it right, because a school build, maybe 30, 50 years on into the future and represent thousands of young people coming through, the stakes are pretty important, pretty high. And in every case, the build side of this just wants to get going. We just want to get the framework up and want to get, and so we have almost in every case experience attention like you suggest. So nothing is perfect. We can always improve. But if we're not in the room and engaging in productive and positive conversations, you do get into awkward situations about timelines and expectations. But we've got to get in the room. We need our students in there, Hamish. Ups to you. That's fabulous contribution. Thank you. And the one thing that I'm appreciating that we do have a little bit of in New Zealand is that my colleagues are paid to go and support schools to do this work. And this means they can bring wisdom from previous experiences and culminate in ongoing developments just by doing that and having skin in the game. The specialists that can come into that too, we've enjoyed having those people involved, but also popping them in the car, not because a system says we need to go and do a roadshow or do anything great, just a local initiative. Let's go and have a look at other schools, and let's not go back and repeat the same old thing like was suggested before, of course. What economies can we bring to this by scaling up and getting together and finding improvement on improvement on improvement? So again, a little bit of organisation, and we can benefit from that. So quite enough from me. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Steve. I think we've lost Hamish. I was going to ask him a question, but he's not here at the moment. But I just wondered, and maybe you guys know as well, I just wondered whether there was a checklist. Is there a checklist somewhere where we can say, okay, these are the factors that we need to consider. These are the questions that we need to ask. I can see Paul laughing. So
I'm laughing because I would love to see that checklist. It would be fantastic. Probably, yeah, that would be a fantastic. For the checklist, it might be just identifying again, going back to inclusive education and having common understanding of what we're talking about and the streams associated with that. Because your checklists then come under the streams. that you're talking about. And yeah, that might be the starting point.
I think Esther has the answer. I think she's got a checklist.
I like that. I'm just going to contribute. Just in terms of, we've written 5 education briefs. We have 7 different settings and our locations for our school, and the importance of the voice of the people included in that. And they highlight what's really important to a school in terms of property, really all the ins and outs of it. But I did put a link in the chat for this document. It's a really big document, but it's created by the UK. And it's called Designing for Disabled Children and Children with Special Educational Needs. And it's got heaps in there about sensory needs and physical needs and all sorts of things. So it's a really good tool to have to look at. It's not necessarily a checklist, but it's certainly a useful document.
Thanks, Esther. Deanne, you have a checklist.
No, I don't. No, I don't have a checklist. I'm actually not a huge fan of checklists because I think it stops people from being innovative and thinking outside the square. So sometimes, yes, I do agree with checklists, but sometimes I don't. But what I wanted to say was to support Steve with what he was talking about with including the student voice. I think there's a little bit of resistance to have kids involved, and my experience with health and a lot of the good stuff that's come out of New Zealand, particularly in Christchurch, Steve, around co-design and using co-design and patient voice in designing health services Christchurch leads the way in that co-design process. So I think it's Louise Ma is the woman who's been doing that work, but I absolutely support that, including the kids in a co-design, true co-design process is very, very helpful.
Leanne, quick question. How do we involve students with different abilities in those voices? So, I mean, some of them might not be able to articulate what their feelings, their perspectives are. How do we get that?
Yeah, like in health, if you've got kids and kids with disability, it's their parents. That's their voice. That's who knows them best and is able to communicate best with them and get out of them what they need. You tread a fine line with that because sometimes it tends to not be the kid's voice, it's the parent's voice, and they might have a different agenda but you know, that comes with any stakeholder. They come with an agenda. So it's just a matter of doing it respectfully and being authentic about the whole process. I think if there's an authentic process, you'll find a way.
Yeah. Thanks, Leanne. Anybody else wants to say anything?
I guess I just like to say that it once again comes back to the resourcing and where that process of engagement is resourced. So, for example, in Scandinavia, it sits with the architect when they are making a bid for a job, and they will go through the stakeholder engagement as part of their process, you know, in terms of putting that bid through to the client. And in my experience in New Zealand is that in the new school builds, and Steve and I have just been having a little chat about that offline, in new school builds, and I think that currently there's 15 of them live in New Zealand at the moment, another couple just about to come online, but that process is resourced through a relatively new alliance called Tare Kura. But the same resourcing is not available, for example, to schools who are doing significant redevelopments. In some of those schools, those redevelopments are kind of like the size of a new school. They're like a $20 million project. And yet that is not actually the resourcing of the stakeholder engagement prior to concept design is not actually resourced. So apart from the fact that they can get a little bit of resourcing for the writing of the education brief. And from, as Chris, both Chris and I discussed before, that is kind of usually put on the principal's table, and they're told that they can get somebody alongside them to help them to write it, but they're not necessarily encouraged to have a full stakeholder engagement. And so one of the things that I think that we need to look at in terms of the systems, and I don't know what the situation is in the countries that you're in, but to look at where is that resourced, and therefore how can it become more systemized so that it does happen both pre-design and at the evaluation stages.
Sorry, we haven't even touched evaluation at all. So there's a whole entire topic to discuss too.
I think just to add a little bit of comment to that, you're quite right, Sandra, to raise the difference between an establishment school, a brand new one, ground up, to a school that already exists and is having substantial ILE developments put in. The establishment school might have the luxury of a lead-in time, and I'll just call it that for the moment, no students, perhaps some staff, perhaps no staff, versus an existing school that's going through a redevelopment where they're trying to function as a normal school. And what? You want a $20 million rebuild put in now? Whereabouts are my kids going to go? How do we do that with interruptions? And so it does, you can hear the need for some kind of a resource to help with that, to get it right, to get it positioned, get the campus set up in a way that's going to be future focused and inclusive of the needs of the teachers. And that's a point too I wanted to raise earlier on. We're talking about the student needs here, but let's also acknowledge that teachers also have a stake in this in regard to the design, and often are the teachers in wheelchairs and so on and so forth that share some of those impairments that we talked about at the beginning of the session today. Really interesting stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'm just conscious of time. Any last words, feedback, comments, insights?
Hello, this is Xiaofei. Yeah, Xiaofei from Beijing, and I'm part of the students education team. And I think the point I want to share are two. Number one, yesterday is International Women's Day. I think it's also a matter, compared to the new build school and with the renovation school, the teachers and the users need to raise the voice to ask for public engagement within the school board. Otherwise, everyone gonna look for gonna ignore the voice or the needs and just get it done, right? So I think number one is we need to raise the voice, and number two is Steelcase is like insight-led company. So we do have a kind of tools which called a pre and post occupancy study, which we can support the architecture and designer and teachers to do what we call, there is one workshop called the discovery web workshop. So we summarize all the common issues across schools and in terms of like technology parts, like the pedagogy parts, and then we let the students and the teachers to vote for that. What are the top 3 or top 5 priorities within your school when you want to organize to start to think about a renovation plan? So I think yeah, we are happy to share the tools later on after session. But I think again, we need to be aware, and we need to raise our voice, and then we need to ask for the rights to be considered, not only for money. It needs to be we need to keep this in our mind every time.
Yeah, thanks, Xiaofei. We probably need another cafe session just on evaluation, and we'll get you and Ambrose and people from Steve's to talk about that perhaps. Leanne, you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to support Zhao with what he was saying about having a space where you can help people to prioritise what they need to do. I think it's overwhelming, and I know, you know, principals in their normal day, they do change quite well. You know, they implement things and they do things differently. But an infrastructure project, whether it be a new one or whether it be a redevelopment, it's like a juggernaut, and it's like a overwhelmingly, you know, there might be 23 changes they've got to do as opposed to just one. So having processes and systems and tools for people to be able to prioritise and rank the complexity of what they've got to do is, I can't emphasise that enough. And like Zhao, we have a suite of tools that help us to do that with school infrastructure. So, and I'm happy to share that if anybody wants that as well. So
yes, please, that would be good. So we get Xiaofei to share his evaluation tool and you to share your tool as well, Leanne. That would be good. Chris, you have your hands up, and I'm going to get you to comment or do whatever you want to do, but I'm also going to get you to summarize today's session. You had your heads up. Don't run. You're mute.
That was what my hand, yeah, that must have been what my hand was up for. Look, I think on a positive notion, I think, you know, the simple fact that discussions like this are happening, and that we have now got people in funded positions, if you like, or in departments and other agencies that are looking very, very specifically at spatial needs of any learners, including, you know, the very specific needs for specific learners that we do need to think really hard about inclusion for. I think that's got to be celebrated. You know, 10 years ago, you know, the level of spatial conversations was minimal by comparison. So I think it's, you know, we're able to have conversations now that were probably inconceivable sort of 10 or certainly 20 years ago in education. Look, I think we've covered it. There's been a lot of ground that's been covered today. I think it's you know, there's been discussion about, you know, who's included and who are we talking about when we're thinking about inclusion. How might we define that? How might we measure the impact that we're actually having, and coming back to Rebecca's points, I think there's some really big challenges that you've laid down there. How do we actually know that we're being successful? You know, as schools we've you know, traditionally monitored relatively easily measurable stuff, and now we're asking schools to start delving much deeper and measure things that, you know, that do relate to, you know, key competencies and more, you know, well-being and more difficult things, more complex and things to measure. And I think that the conversations we're having now point to a whole new category really of things that we're asking teachers to think about, and that as a community we need to grow expertise in. But I think the simple fact we're asking the questions and having the discussions, and that there are people now in places where they can push those agendas, I think is fantastic.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah,
so I don't know if that summarized, but what a great session.
Yeah, what a great session.
Buzzing.
Thank you, everybody, for your contributions today. As Wes said, the recording will be made available to everybody in the network. And I've also put my email there. So if you have any resource or tool that you want to share, send it to me, and I'll make sure that everybody, you know, gets access to the resource as well. Have a good afternoon, morning, night, wherever you are, and I'll see you guys soon in the next session. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.